In this module, we're going to discuss surveys and experiments. So an online survey, it's a structured questionnaire so that your target audience is going to complete over the internet. It's generally through filling out a form. This can vary in length and format with different question styles, such as a Likert scale, multiple choice. And it's the equivalent to pen and paper surveys, but via a digital medium. And it can be web-based or an email survey. And so when we look at the benefits of an online survey, say compared to a pen and paper survey, one of the big benefits is cost. That even though you may have to pay for a software package, many times the cost is significantly reduced than say it would have cost to have a location or an office where you would have people come to complete the survey in person, where you would have to have, say, multiple rooms or the ability to have privacy. So the cost structure ends up being much more efficient when you're able to do things online, especially also through when we talk about online recruitment for participants and the ability to give access to people outside of what might be considered a convenience sampling. Another advantage is time. Many times the ability to complete a survey online, in terms when you look at the big picture of how long it would take somebody to come to an office or come to your research setting, complete the survey, finish it, turn it in, go back. You're saving a lot of time, both for the participant, but then also for the researcher in terms of collecting the data. So before the internet, or if you're doing offline research, they're completing the pen and paper format, and then you have to then go in and either through a piece of software or data analysis or Excel or whatever it may be, a lot of times people had to manually enter in the survey responses. Now, if you're using online survey software, all of the answers are already in a format that you can easily download and then analyze. So you're actually saving quite a bit of time using an online survey versus the traditional pen and paper format. With design also, there may be more flexibility around design when you're using online surveys in terms of, we talk about how to design a survey, but the way that you're formatting it, the colors, and the availability of the design options. So these are all benefits to using online surveys. But of course, there's always challenges. So some of the challenges with online surveys, when you're sending them out and you're recruiting people, a lot of times they can be considered junk mail, especially if they're coming from a distribution list or you're using the software program itself to reach out to people. There may be a sample bias. So one of the things is that when you're recruiting people online, you are limited to the fact that you're asking people who can access a computer. And so this can influence your sample. This can be used for your population. Is it representative? Is there a bias in the sampling? There's concerns around privacy and security. So you're introducing a third party into the interaction, where if somebody comes and they fill out their survey, they hand it to you, and now you own that data and you're in control of where the data goes. When you're using a software program, say like something like SurveyMonkey, you're relying on a third party to be able to protect the privacy and the security of your participants. So you may be doing your due diligence when looking at survey software, but still at the same time, if the software was ever to have a security breach or data breach, there could be risk of problems with privacy and security. So that's one of the challenges to get into online surveying. Sometimes you can get multiple submissions. And this may be intentional, maybe not, but when somebody comes into an office or they hand you the paper, you know who the person is. So this also ties into the wrong person completing the survey. When you're sending out, say, a link to a survey, you may not always know if somebody is doing multiple submissions or if the wrong person is completing the survey. So an example of this is I've done a lot of research in the security industry, and the security industry is well ripe with hackers and people for the fun of it who just like to just monkey with things. And there's always that concern that when I send out this survey link, is it possible that somebody on the other end is completing the survey multiple times? They're trying to skew the data. I mean, it's possible. It does happen, especially in the hacker community, where there's for some, that's the fun of monkeying around in computers. So it is something just to be considered, that when you have somebody face to face, or that you are doing the survey with offline, you generally know if it's the right or the wrong person. But online, there's no way of guaranteeing that if my demographic is, say, women under 45, I have no way of knowing for sure if the person completing my survey is a woman under 45. It could be somebody pretending to be. It could be somebody just filling out questions. We don't know why, but the fact is that there could be multiple submissions. There could be the wrong person completing the data. So we just want to take that into consideration, that there is that possibility for the unknown when it comes to our participants in online data collection. Other areas that can be a challenge. So when we talk about sources of error, similar to what with some of the challenges, when we're talking about coverage error, we want to make sure that we are covering the population that we desire, that the people that are participating are representation of the population. And so this also ties into sampling error. And when we talked about this in the research design modules, both for offline research and traditional research, this also very much applies to online research, especially with that caveat of you are asking for people that have access to a computer. So you may be ruling out different socioeconomic statuses, different people who may prefer not to use technology. There's some people that ought not to use a phone or a computer, or maybe people who may not be familiar. If you're researching perhaps a senior population who may not be as comfortable online. So the fact that we are doing research within a digital arena and new technologies is something that we do want to be aware of, because it could impact our ability to get a correct sample, to make sure that we're covering the populations that we want to cover within our sample. Another source of error can be the non-response error. And so this can be when somebody starts a survey and then they don't finish it, they don't complete all of the questions. And so then you end up with either basic responses that you can't use because the surveys have not been filled out to completion. So we want to make sure that we're always looking for these sources of error or anything that can bias the data when we're collecting online information. So when designing an online survey, there's lots to take into consideration. And this is one of the benefits of using the software programs. If you've used an online survey program, so usually you can have a welcome page. So something that introduces yourself, introduces the format, and gives some instructions and some background. This is many times when you will bring up the opportunity, the different options, the opportunity to convey your contact information, the fact that the research is voluntary, ways that if there's something they feel uncomfortable with, that they can opt out. So a lot of the ethical items are covered within the welcome page. Then you may have a layer of access. So this may be a specific PIN that you've given somebody, or a certain way that they have access to their survey. So these are for some of the software programs that allow different types of completion, or different times where someone can start a survey and then come back to it. Again, something we do want to be careful with in terms of letting people complete the survey at different times, because that can invite inconsistencies in the survey, especially depending on what it is that you're measuring. So if you are allowing people to access their survey again and or change answers or make any modifications, we just want to make sure that you're controlling for that and that you are making it so, if there is any kind of difference in mood or fluctuation or time of day, a lot of times when we're doing survey research, you're trying to capture that moment in time, or that this perception. And if that can change, somebody may have a different opinion or a different mood, or maybe they need to eat, maybe it's been a long day, and so they started the survey and they had one perspective, but then so much has happened that by the end of the day, when they come back to it, their mood has changed, and it's different from how it may have been when they were starting it. So just things to consider. With that first question, so the first question I have to say is one of the most important ones, because it's usually the one that everybody will fill out as they start with the first questions, but it sets the tone. And so if, let's say, you're asking for questions that may be very personal or maybe triggering for people, that's not usually the first question that you want to start off with. We start off with easy questions, work them into being comfortable with it. And then towards the end, you start getting into the harder questions. The first questions tend to be more of a softball question that's clearly understood and gets them used to the survey process. You want to make sure that you're formatting everything very clearly, that it's easy to follow, because we don't want to create any interference where somebody isn't able to follow along with the format. So then this ties in next to then color and visual experience. So if you're taking a survey and you're saying it's bright colors or it relies on colors and somebody is colorblind or they're distracted in some way by the visual appearance of the survey, that it's hard to follow, that's going to interfere with their ability to do an online survey. And this is something that if you end up taking human computer interaction, you'll learn a lot about the way that the format, the colors, the visual appearance of something can impact the way that somebody is able to move forward. How usable is this template? How easy are they able to understand it? Are they able to read the words? And so they'll find that there's recommendations for it to say have a darker background with lighter colors, or a lighter background with darker colors, or so it's easy to read, that the fonts are big enough so that it's easy to read, especially for people who may not have very good vision. So you want to make sure that you're not creating an environment that could interrupt the ability to complete the survey. You want to make sure that your instructions for each question are clear for your response format. So especially if you're swapping between formats. So if you've got multiple choice and then you move to a Likert scale, but that you're very much that you're clearly articulating what the difference between circling a 1 is or a 7. So making sure that the instructions, the response formats, that those are all very clear. So then we get into mandatory responses. And so it's said that one of the sources of errors is completion error. So how do we get people to make sure they respond? So with mandatory responses, it's tricky because we always want to make sure that we're not forcing people to answer questions. We want to give people the option. If there's a question they don't feel comfortable answering, you want to give them the option to not have to answer it. We want to make sure that they're not feeling uncomfortable, that they're not feeling obligated. On the other hand, sometimes it's human nature, especially when looking at a screen, that they might accidentally skip a question. So sometimes by ensuring that the responses are mandatory, you're also then ensuring the fact that people will answer the questions and that you won't get surveys that are not fully completed. So one of the ways around that is to add an option within the question that says no response given, or NA, does not apply. So for me personally, I like to do mandatory responses. So I make sure that I'm getting the responses, because sometimes people just accidentally forget a question. I've been filling out surveys and then I go back and say, what did I miss? And it turns out I've missed a checkbox or something like that. But to make sure with any mandatory question, there is at least one selection that they can opt into if they do not feel comfortable responding. So we want to make sure that we're always following those ethical guidelines to make sure that we're making people feel comfortable and feel safe, and that they are able to opt out if they want to. You can provide options to skip directions if you have very lengthy directions, and let's say that you decide to go from how you want to format it, where you've got a page of questions and then directions and a page of questions. So if they're repetitive, you can give the option to skip directions. Scrolling from question to question, we want to make sure that we are minimizing the amount of work that people have to do to complete the survey. So there's some preference in terms of, do you do one question per page, or do you do all of the questions in one page? We're seeing the response choices. You want to make sure that you're giving those response choices, that they're clear, that there's a way to opt out. Progress, you can sometimes give people a progress bar. And again, the question structures. So how are you structuring the questions in a way? Are you structuring them in a way that makes sense, that is easy to understand, that's easy to follow? Is the wording correct? What are they going through a good process? So all of these come together and are things to consider when you're designing an online survey. So things to consider. A lot of times the online software programs will help you with this, and they'll do this. They'll make recommendations. They'll actually have questions that they have pre-screened and tested. So all things to take into consideration as you're designing your survey. And if you think that there's anything that with your survey design that you're noticing patterns in that may be impacting it, to make note of that and then determine what it is that you want to do. So if you find that you did not get a lot of responses, something you may want to make note of is that there was not a lot of response completion, or that you did make mandatory responses, but there was opt-in. So much like great deal what we've been talking about over the course of the semester is, if something comes up that may be an outlier, if there's something that comes up that may be impacting the data, that you bring that up, that you're making sure that you're addressing any ways that your data may be impacted, and then accounting for that. So delivering of an online survey. So all of the ways that we reach out to people, and how do we get people? So what is your method of sampling? How are you going to recruit these people? And so of course we have to consider then that coverage error and that sampling error of when you're reaching out to the sample population, keeping in mind that you are restricting yourself to people who have access to a computer. And what does that mean for your study? If your population, if that doesn't impact your population, then okay. If you're, say, looking at remote tribes in Borneo, then perhaps online surveys may not be your best bet for how to communicate with them, right? So we're always looking at the way that how your method of sampling is impact your data. Okay? Contact delivery modes. How are you reaching out to people? How are you trying different pieces? Are you posting to a message board? Are you sending in an email invitation? What happens if that email goes into spam? Are you trying different approaches to the delivery of the message that you're recruiting for this survey, or that you're recruiting for participants? You want to look at your invitation design to make sure that it's neat, it's clean, it's complete, and that it addresses what the survey is about, what the research is about, and it's not too overly wordy, or that they're able to understand what is being asked of them. If people get a very wordy invitation that is not clear for them right up front about what it is they're being asked to do, or the design is not well designed, then that may be put some people off for wanting to respond and complete. So I'm sending out pre-notifications and reminders. So we're going to be sending out this survey, please watch for it. And then reminders to submit it. And so sometimes this can happen just for, say, general surveys, like so if you're ever just in an organization, let's say you're going an organizational development route, you're doing surveys for a particular group. You say, please remember to complete the survey. So, for example, you find people who have attended an event, maybe, and so afterwards it says, we'd like to do a survey of your event experience. And so they reach out to everybody who attended the event. And so they'll send out notifications, they'll send out reminders in the hope of getting that data back. And then another option is to send out incentives. Anybody who completes the survey will then be entered for a drawing for a $50 gift card, or sometimes those incentives can help encourage people to participate in your online survey. So when you think about how you're going to reach out to your sample, you want to consider the different methods, how you're going to reach them, how you're going to reach your sample, and then what strategies you're going to be using for your outreach. And then also consider, what does it take to get somebody to complete the survey? So there's societal reasons like survey fatigue, perceptions of surveys, perhaps perception of the topic, how comfortable they feel with the topic, how long the survey might be. Then there might be the respondent challenges. So maybe personality factors, are certain personalities of certain people likely to be more likely to complete a survey. There may be socioeconomic factors. And so if you think, if somebody is very busy, they're doing it at work, they start to fill it out, then they get distracted and have to come back to it. Sometimes they might close the window. And there's a lot of different reasons why the respondent may not complete the survey. Survey return, are they actually able to access the survey software and web page or tool? So when you're looking at survey software, you want to make sure that it works on multiple web browsers. For example, if it's not, or if there's something that somebody needs to download, does it work for multiple computer platforms? Just from a technological perspective, are they able to complete and submit the data? Is the survey process and technology working? And then another challenge for completion of the survey is just data safety. Are there concerns about privacy? So if you're asking somebody questions about something that's very personal, they may not feel comfortable submitting that online. As I said, you're relying on this third party to be able to hold to that data. So especially we want to make this way, we make sure there's not a lot of identifying data when we're collecting surveys. So we want to make sure that we are preserving people's privacy, that they're not able to be identified. So if there ever was a security breach in your software program, that it would not compromise the safety or the of your participants. But the concern for the participant could still be there and could interrupt them in completing the survey. So then we go into online experiments. So online experiments are a little bit trickier because you're creating an environment. So controlled experience, for example, might normally be, say, in a laboratory setting. And so you're controlling for all of the variables and then you're testing. So when you're doing something online, this can be some challenging to make an environment that you are controlling for. It's possible, and we'll talk about how to do that. We want to look at natural experiments. So this is a large scale event. You are collecting as many variables, so you're making observations and then you're looking at correlations. And so you may have these different experiments and then looking at the variables and seeing, are there correlations? Are there interactions? What's happening here? And then your field experiments. So you're observing a natural setting where less controls may be applied. So maybe you're observing, say, a video game format, and you're watching the way that a group online works together in an online environment. And so it's a field experiment. You're just watching the way that the group interacts. Versus having a controlled environment where maybe you have created the game and you're inviting people to play a game that you personally have created the environment on, and now you're testing variables to see how they'll react in this online environment. So different ways of doing online experiments. But the main thing we're focused on is when you are in an online format, how are you controlling for that environment? Because as we know from looking at more traditional and offline research methods, that being able to control for the variables is something that is important, that we're trying to make sure that we're eliminating things that could impact or compromise the data due to the environment. So benefits of online experiences: sample size. Sometimes you can get a larger sample size than you can from offline experiments. You can get diversity and generalizability. You're able to reach a broader base. So you're not limited always by a convenience sample. You're able to go beyond the traditional laboratory setting and people that can actually come into the laboratory controlled setting, and you're able to get more diversity and to generalize it to a larger population, because you might not just be looking at college students. You're actually able to look to see what goes on in a more diverse population. Participant bias. So again, you're able to expand beyond that. You're not just picking out the people that you have access to. You're also looking at the experimenter participation and demand characteristics. By being online, you're not involved quite as much. So if they have any biases about who you might be as a researcher, or vice versa, or there's any dynamics that happen that just naturally happen when we're interacting with somebody, that can often be eliminated in an online environment. They may not be able to see you. They may not connect with the researcher. There may not be any dynamic there in the way that with offline experiments. So let's say in a college setting, you may have a student that you know participating in your research, and then that makes the student, it impacts the student because they know you. You may not know the people who are participating in your experiment. So the demand characteristics or the experimenter participation is limited, helping to make sure that you have less of an impact on your data. And then, of course, the challenges. So the levels of control. How is it that you're able to control the environment? And so when you're designing an experiment, an online experiment, you have to make sure that you are creating an environment that you do have control over. And so many times this is really limiting to things that can actually happen in the internet. So let's say you're doing an experiment on cyberbullying. So you're controlling for the environment, you're looking at how the cyberbullying is occurring, but you're looking at it in a very specific environment, so that it's not as broad, it's not as, there's not as many variables that could be out of your control. So you want to make sure that you're specifically looking at how you can control the environment. What are you ruling out? Are you looking at a particular message board? So if you're looking at posting a message board, what kind? What's the format? What's the level of control? Because there's so many things that can have impact the ability to make sure, well, are people posting on this in this chat room because it's easier to access than this other chat room that isn't? Okay, well, now I have to create chat rooms that are all similar, because otherwise the different usability could impact my data. So you have to make sure that you're implementing these levels of control in the environment. We talked about representativeness, as I've said before, so I hope you've recognized it by now, that when we are doing online research, we are limited to people who are able to get online. So are we able to represent everybody in your population? This is a challenge. And then attrition, the same thing is that you may find people don't complete your online experiment, and whether this is because it's easy for them to just log on. There can also just be networking errors and technology basis. So if you're doing an online experiment that requires the ability to have a good internet connection and somebody doesn't, they may end up not being able to participate fully. And so there may be an increase in attrition when you're looking at your online experiments. So all things to take into consideration, and like with any challenges, you want to be able to recognize them, identify them, and account for them. So if you have any questions about anything covered this week, about we talked a lot in the original research models about survey research and quantitative data. So with being online, there's still the same format and the same challenges and sampling and everything that comes up when you're designing quantitative data is the same piece. And so you're just now translating that into an online format. And so you want to take a look at everything that we learned about quantitative data and say, what does it mean now that it's online? Does it impact it? What role does the internet play? And you want to be able to account for that. You may look at it and say, no, I've done my statistics. I've looked at this. I don't think that I'm finding anything out that has not been found out in an offline format. Many of the tried and true valid and reliable surveys and experimental measures have been tested online. And so you want to be able to account for that too. So if you're going to be doing something online, then you take a look and you say, okay, this has also been converted to an online format, and it remains valid and it remains reliable. So if you have that information, then you want to be able to account for that and respond for that. When you're conducting surveys, depending on the goal of what you're doing, if you are just doing a survey and that is the sole purpose, and this is a survey that you want to take to publication, I highly recommend that you do some sort of statistical analysis on your question, whether it be working with a statistician or Chromex Alpha, or some way of making sure that that statistically your questions are valid, are reliable, because it becomes, once you've created the questions, if you want to take that to publication, there's going to be questions to make sure that that your survey was well designed and that you are able to prove some reliability and validity. So again, if you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out, and otherwise, until next time, thank you.